And today we're going to talk about standing before the King of Kings. And this is kind of a follow-up sermon on a sermon I had a couple months ago about Paul, Apostle Paul, before three kings. And my brother-in-law, Alex, said, well, why didn't you put Nero in there? Because Paul stood before Nero. So I decided I'd follow this up with a sermon on Paul standing before the then-known king of all kings, the king of the New World at that time. And that was Nero, the Caesar of Rome. But before we do that, I'd like a quick review for those people who were not here last time about Paul standing before three kings. And in that service, we talked about important things that we as Christians should know, we should have in our Christian life. We need to have a testimony. Everyone needs a testimony. They need a reason for why they live the life they live. If you don't know why you live the way you're living, there's no purpose. There's no reason to why you believe what you believe. And that's something that Paul had. And you can go back, I encourage you all to go back in Acts, the last couple chapters of Acts, and read about Paul before Festus, Felix, and Agrippa, the three kings, before he sailed off to Rome. So do I have a testimony? Does everyone remember Brother Daniel Balbach's testimony? That is more powerful than anything else, is to have a proper testimony. And it doesn't have to be the prodigal son testimony. It can be the raised in the church testimony. But everyone should have a reason. So I hope that everyone has been thinking about that this Sabbath, and I hope you revisit that in your life. Because someday we may be asked to give an account of why we believe what we believe. Like we read in 2 Timothy 4:2, preach the word, be instant or ready in season and out of season. That means at all times I need to be ready to give an account of what I believe. We learned that in Paul's interaction with these three kings, there were different responses by the kings. You had Felix, a corrupt king. He was, I have stars on the faces of the kings that actually were touched, that actually realized and saw their sins. They were what we call convicted. They were convicted that they were bad people, but they didn't go anything beyond that. They pushed it aside. You have Felix, he was the procrastinator. He said, when I have a convenient time, then I will call for you. And Paul stayed 2 years there in the prison cell of Felix. And he talked with Felix many, many times, but there was never a convenient time. We talked about the history of Felix and the end of Felix. We talked about Festus, the replacement of Felix. And he was the typical Roman governor of the time, a pagan. And when he heard this, he said, Paul, you are mad. You're insane. This is foolishness. So he had no conviction. He just wrote it off as insanity. And we talked about his conclusion. And then finally, Agrippa, the Jewish king. We went over his history, his wife, his family lineage, the different Agrippas and the Herods. He came from the line of Herod, the last king of the line of the Herodian kings. And we reviewed the almost thou persuadest me to become a Christian. He was somebody who was also touched, also convicted by his own sins. He saw generations of Herods come and either reject Jesus or try to throw Peter in prison or think that they are God. He saw all the results of all of that. But still, he mocked the message of Paul and rejected the invitation. Because Paul said, Agrippa, I know you know the way. Today, we will go into a little bit about Paul before Nero. I do think, though, it's very important that we review Christ's Object Lessons, page 117. It talks about Christians, because while we're talking about giving our testimony before others, specifically before kings, these kings all had choices that we ourselves have today. And Ellen White says very clearly here that they do not die, they being the Christians, they being us. They do not die to self, that Christ may live in them. Therefore, they do not find the precious pearl. They have not overcome unholy ambition and their love for worldly attractions. They do not take up the cross and follow Christ in the path of self-denial and sacrifice. Among Christians, yet not fully Christians, they seem near to the kingdom of heaven, but they cannot enter there. So almost there, almost at the gate. But you know what? You've not crossed. You've not crossed the path. Almost but not wholly saved means not to be almost, but to be wholly lost. So when we are presented with the cross of Christ, what should we do? Take off our burdens, take off our entanglements, take off the things that these kings had holding them down. They had position, they had pride, they had status among the people they worked with. They refused to take off these burdens and come as they were to the cross. Now we fast forward to Paul standing before Nero, the emperor of the world. Not much is said about Paul before Nero. 2 Timothy is one of the last books that Paul ever wrote, and he only alludes to his interactions with Nero. There is not much written, so unfortunately we won't have too many Bible verses. There might be some in some apocryphal books like the Acts of Paul. Some church fathers mention some things about how Paul was martyred, but not much is known. I did find a lot in the writings of Ellen White, from Sketches to the Life of Paul and also Acts of the Apostles, and I encourage everybody as part of the digestion today of what we have read to kind of go over that. And those are very beautiful chapters, the last few chapters of Sketches of the Life of Paul. But before we go into Paul standing before Nero, I'd like to talk about who Nero was. I like a little bit of a background like we did about the other kings. So Nero was also known as Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. He was born December 15th, AD 37, a little after Christ. His father was Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus. He was a great general, but he was a very, very cruel man. He was known as a man of cruel appetites and poor desires. He was known for running a little boy over with his chariot in the Appian Way. Couldn't care less. Another time he gouged out the eye of one of the wealthy people on the Senate forum. Just gouged the guy's eye out and went on his way. He was known for killing people who he ordered to drink a certain amount of alcohol, and if they couldn't make that amount, he would kill them. So a very, very cruel man. And we don't know much about him, but he died of edema when Nero was only 3 years of age. So the little exposure Nero had of his father was a cruel man, and he probably did not remember very much of him. Nero was born to a woman called Agrippina the Younger, and she was of a royal lineage. She was related to the Caesars, from the family of the Caesars. But her life was characterized by vengeance, scandal, and political maneuvering. She instilled these traits in her son, Nero, from a very young age. Now, her brother was Caligula, who at one time was the emperor of Rome. And Caligula is known for being nearly insane, but he was sane enough to get rid of his sister. Because he considered her such a maneuvering, crooked woman, he exiled her out of Rome and away from his kingdom because he didn't trust her. He was afraid of her. So he exiles her away, and that leaves Nero spending many years of his life without his mother. Unfortunately, Caligula doesn't last very long. He's a crooked man. He's insane. The Senate can't handle him, and he's eventually assassinated. So what happens is the uncle of Agrippina, the mother of Nero, he becomes Caesar. And since his niece is exiled, he decides, you know what, I'll bring her back. Poor lady, I'll bring her back. He brings her back, and what does she do? She gets into his life. She frames his wife that she's been unfaithful. A long thing happens. The wife accidentally dies because she's been an unfaithful woman. Agrippina becomes the wife of Claudius, her uncle. And she starts to rule. And what does she do? He has a son. Claudius has a son who is the rightful heir to the throne. And Agrippina works into his life, maneuvers around, and convinces Claudius that Nero should be the next Caesar. Eventually, Claudius says, you know what, this isn't right. I think my true son should be the king of this land. And when Agrippina finds that out, she has him assassinated, has him poisoned. This is the mother. This is the life that Nero grew up into. While she was away, while she was exiled, poor Nero, he had nobody. He was raised in almost total poverty, historians believe. So he was raised by a barber and a dancer. And when his mother finally returned, she groomed him to be a very dysfunctional adult. Nero loved and embraced music. He loved the theater. He loved chariot racing. He loved sports. So he would do things like go to Athens, Greece, later on when he was emperor, and he would want to race chariots, or he would want to go and be in the theater, and he would play multiple parts. He'd be the man, the heroine, the crook, everything. He'd do it all. And he would just carry on and on and on in the theater for so long that people would fake seizures just to get out of watching, because he would just go on and on and on. They just couldn't handle him. He thought he was the best musician, the best the world has ever seen. And that's kind of the life he lived. He almost, in a way, while he was a crooked emperor, he would rather, his passion was music and theater. That was the man that Nero was. When he finally became emperor of Rome, his mother and him decided that his brother-in-law, or his stepbrother, who was the true heir to the throne, was a threat. So Nero held a big party on that brother's birthday, and unfortunately, Nero was an expert poisoner, and his brother and his stepbrother died pretty quickly. And as he died, Nero said, "This man must be having a seizure. Take him away so he can rest on his bed," and he never got off his bed again. So Nero continued on what his mother did, killing his way to maintain the throne. And time passed, and Nero became king of kings, okay? Now, at first, his mother ruled Rome because he was very young. He came around 18, 19 years of age to the throne, and his mother had a lot of power. She held on to that well. But he had some tutors. One was Seneca and various other people, philosophers, who helped guide him. They tried to control him. They tried to get him to do the right thing. So initially in his rulership, he was very generous. He gave to the people. He had a lower rate of trials that were unfair and people that just vanished in the night. So there was hope that, you know what, maybe he might be an okay emperor. But as time passed on, his daily displays of liberalitas, or generosity, clementia, known as mercy, comitus, known as accessibility or openness of the government, would be shrouded at night. He would commit all sorts of murder, assault, and theft. And that's how he became the crooked man that we know of him today. Into all of this, Paul arrives, coming into Rome. Nero is the emperor. He has set the standard of vice. How would you expect Paul, from a small Christian sect, to have any fair trial? Paul spends 2 years in house arrest in Rome. Nero probably thought that this was not a very important thing. And what do we know from those 2 years there? These 2 years in prison were a blessing. They've looked back and they think that Paul was in a very central part in Rome. He was near a main highway going through Rome. And there he spoke with the Jews in Rome and also with the fledgling Christians. And he started to really build Christianity. In fact, him and Peter were the founders of Christianity in Rome at that time. And Ellen White here mentions in Acts of the Apostles that Nero seemed to have obliterated from his soul the last trace of the divine and even of the human, and to bear only the impress of the satanic. His attendants and his courtiers were in general of the same character as himself, fierce, debased, and corrupt. To all appearance, it would be impossible for Christianity to gain a foothold in the court of Nero, in the court and the palace of Nero. But that's exactly what happened. During these 2 years, lots of Christians were born and developed, even in the court and palace of Nero. The details of iniquity practiced in the court of this prodigy of vice are too degrading and too horrible for description. He abandoned wickedness and created his abandoned wickedness created disgust and loathing even in many who were forced to share in his crimes. They were in constant fear as to what enormities he would suggest next. Yet even such crimes as Nero's did not shake the allegiance of his subjects. He was more acknowledged as the absolute ruler of the civilized world, and more than this, he was made the recipient of divine honors and worshipped as a god. Now, I'd like to bring up the term gospel, because we think of the gospel as the good news that Jesus has come and died, and now we can live and start the new kingdom with him and be reunited with him. Well, in that time, the gospel was a play on words, because the real gospel known to everybody else in the Roman Empire was that Rome was in town. This is a new world. The good news, the gospel is Rome has conquered everything, and now we have peace. The Roman peace, the Pax Romana, that was the gospel. The gospel was that Nero, the King of Kings, the God of gods, was ruling the world, and now we can live a life of peace. Because prior to this, you had smaller empires, people, fractions, groups were fighting each other, and there was a lot of bloodshed. So that was the good news of the time. And then here comes Paul and the apostles talking about the gospel of Christ, which was kind of play on words at that time. Because it really wasn't the Roman rule, the New World Order. It was the New World Order of Christ, the reunification of different peoples, the rich, the poor, the slaves under Christ. So it was kind of a play of words, and actually very threatening to the Roman Empire at that time. So Nero was viewed as it were a god. So what does God do? Paul appears before Nero the first time after 2 years in prison. And Ellen White writes in Sketches from the Life of Paul, page 302, God did shield his servant at Paul's examination. The charges against him were not sustained, and contrary to the general expectation with regard for justice, wholly at the variance of his character, Nero declared the prisoner guiltless. Paul's fetters were struck off. He was again a free man. Amazing. That's all we know. That's all we know about Paul before the King of Kings the first time. He was released, and thank God he was released, because no sooner did he get out of town within the next year, Rome burns. Rome burns to the ground. And everyone has heard about this story, the story of Rome burning. It was well known that for a long time, Nero wanted to expand his palace. But there was so much. Rome was full. On the 7 hills, people lived there, wealthy people, and no one wanted to give up their land. And then suddenly Rome burns, and up to 70% of the city is destroyed. 50% of the population becomes homeless in days. So Rome becomes a huge upheaval. And then a rumor emerges that Nero, carried away in a maniacal fit, played his lyre, composing a verse extolling the beauty of the flames that burned Rome to the ground. As the fingers began to point in the direction of the royal palace, Nero sought a scapegoat to bear the flame for the fire. And what did Nero do? Well, there were people claiming that there's good news, that there's somebody else who's king, somebody else who brings peace, somebody else who has the gospel, and those are the Christians. And since the Christians were growing in his household and growing in Rome, he said that the Christians started the fire of Rome, and he had a convenient scapegoat. The destruction of the Christians was so severe that Josephus, and I think Ellen White, quoting Josephus, says that even the Roman citizens who got whipped into this fury of blaming them, they even began to feel sorry for the Christians and the thousands that were martyred and destroyed as punishment for the burning of Rome. The satanic device that Nero made succeeded. Thousands of the followers of Christ, men, women, and children, were put to death in the most cruel manner. Some were crucified, some covered with the skins of wild beasts and torn in pieces by dogs. Others were clothed in garments of inflammable material and were set on fire at night to illuminate the circus of the Vatican. and the pleasure gardens of Nero. Thus, this monster in human form amused the public by exhibiting his victims in their dying agonies, while he himself stood by, taking the keenest delight in their misery. Degraded and hardened as they were, the Romans, and bitter as their prejudice was against the Christians, began to pity them. It was said that Nero would walk around in his charioteer's garment, parading around at the feasts as the Christians were burning. And even the Roman citizens themselves were pitying the loss of the Christians. So at this time, Christ saved Paul. We don't exactly know where he went in those next couple years. He wrote many books in that time. He may have gone back to Galatia, to Turkey, in that area, and revisited the churches. Some feel he may have even gone as far as Spain and started new churches there, depending on church traditions. But no one really knows 100%. Either way, somehow, Paul is arrested again by instigating a problem somewhere, and he is brought back to Rome to stand on trial again before Nero. But this time, the popularity of Christianity has changed. This time, he is coming into town where Christians are being slaughtered by the thousands, and he knows that no one will stand to support him. But when Paul was summoned before Nero, no man ventured to act as his counsel or advocate. No friend was at hand even to preserve a record of the charges brought against him or of the arguments that he urged in his own defense. Among the Christians at Rome, there was not one who came forward to stand by him in that trying hour. If you can imagine that. And that's why there's nothing written in the Bible, brothers and sisters. Nobody was there. Where was Luke? Luke, who wrote Acts, he finishes it right before Paul is brought back again. Where were all the others? Nobody came. No one was there to support him. Paul alludes to this in his last letter, 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy 4, 16 through 17, he says, "At my first answer no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. I pray God that it may not be laid to their charge. Notwithstanding, the Lord stood by me and strengthened me, that by me the preaching might be fully known, and that all the Gentiles might hear." There is a very beautiful section, sketches the life of Paul, or even Acts of the Apostles. Ellen White says pretty much the same thing in chapter 48. And she says, Paul and Nero face to face, with an exclamation mark. And she really contrasts this beautifully. And she says here, Paul before Nero, how striking the contrast, the haughty monarch before whom the man of God was to answer for his faith, had reached the height of earthly power, authority, and wealth, as well as the lowest depths of crime and iniquity. In power and greatness he stood unrivaled. There was none to question his authority, none to resist his will. Kings laid their crowns at his feet, powerful armies marched at his command, and the ensigns of his navies betokened victory. His statue was set up in the halls of justice, and the decrees of senators and the decisions of judges were but the echo of his will. Millions bowed in his obedience to his mandates, and the name of Nero made the world tremble. To incur his displeasure was more dreaded than a pestilence. And then Paul, without money, without friends, without counsel, the aged prisoner stood before Nero. The countenance of the emperor bearing the shameful record of the passions that raged within, the face of the accused telling of the heart and peace of God. Paul's experience had been one of poverty, self-denial, and suffering. Notwithstanding constant misinterpretation, reproach, and abuse, by which his enemies had endeavored to intimidate him, he had fearlessly held aloft the standard of the cross. Like his master, he had been a homeless wanderer. Like him, he had lived to bless humanity. How could Nero, a capricious, passionate, licentious tyrant, understand or appreciate the character and motives of this Son of God. Again, the Jews argue their case against Paul. Again, they say this is a man who stirs things up, makes trouble. Well, Ellen White makes it very clear in Sketches of the Life of Paul, page 313, that Paul once more has the opportunity to bring forth the light of Christ to those in need and to the pagans around him. Never before had that company listened to the words like these. Light was shining into the darkened minds that would gladly follow the guidance of its precious rays. The truth spoken on that occasion would never die. Though the utterance of the feeble, aged prisoner, they were destined to shake the nations. They empowered with a power that would live through all time, influencing the hearts of men when the lips that uttered them should be silent in the martyr's grave. Earnestly, he pointed his hearers to the great sacrifice made on behalf of the fallen race. Presented before them, man in his true dignity and value. An infinite price had been paid for man's redemption. Provision had been made that he might be exalted to share the throne of God and become the heir of immortal riches. By angel messengers, the earth was connected with heaven, and all the deeds of man, good or evil, were open before the eyes of infinite justice. Paul's countenance glows with the light of heaven, as though reflecting the rays of the sun. Many who look upon him at the hall of judgment saw his face as it had been the face of an angel. Tears dimmed many eyes that had never before been seen to weep. The gospel message found its way to the minds and hearts of many who had or would never have listened but for the imprisonment of Paul. So brothers and sisters, sometimes in bad situations, it creates an opportunity. It creates an opportunity that he never would have had. Paul spoke to the greatest people of that nation at that time. And I find it very interesting because as you read this afternoon, Acts of the Apostles, Sketches from the Life of Paul, this is vivid. And I wonder, where does Ellen White get this? Did she see this in a vision? Is this from lots of research, from writings, ancient writings of that time, of those theologians or early church fathers who may have heard stories passed down? But this is, in my opinion, from what I have looked at, this is some of the most vivid documentation of the trial that Paul had before Nero. Never had Nero heard the truth as he heard it upon that occasion. Never had the enormous guilt of his own life been revealed to him as it was revealed that day. The light of heaven had pierced the sin-polluted chambers of his soul. He quaked with terror at the thought of the tribunal before which the ruler of the world should be arraigned, and where his deeds should meet a just reward. He was afraid of the apostles' God, and he dared not pass sentence upon Paul, against whom no accusation had been sustained. A sense of awe for a time restrained his bloodthirsty spirit. For a moment, heaven had been opened before him. What did he see in that moment when the heavens were opened for him? I pull this not from Acts of the Apostles, but I pull this from the Great Controversy. In the presence of the assembled inhabitants of the earth and heaven, the final coronation of the Son of God takes place. And now invested with supreme majesty and power, the King of Kings pronounces sentence upon the rebels against his government and executes justice upon those who have transgressed his law and oppressed his people. I saw the dead, great and small, stand before God, and the books were opened. It talks about how there is Agrippina, the mother of Nero, and there is Nero, both standing in that group of people. Okay? The books are open. And there they see all of the plan of redemption. poured out before them. And there they also see all the sins that they have ever committed. And there Agrippina sees how she could have raised her son and how she raised him inappropriately and how she made him the beast that he really was. And then it goes on to say, there is Satan, who also claims to be God and king of this world, who seems paralyzed as he beholds the glory and majesty of Christ. He who once was the covering cherub remembers whence he has fallen, a shining seraph, the son of the morning. How changed, how degraded from the council, where he once was honored, he forever is excluded. He sees another now standing near the Father, veiling his glory. He has seen the crown placed upon the head of Christ by an angel of lofty stature and majestic presence, and he knows that this exalted position of this angel might have been his. The whole wicked world stand arraigned at the bar of God on the charge of high treason against the government of heaven. They have none to plead their cause. They are without excuse, and the sentence is eternal death, and it is pronounced against them. It is now evident that all the wages of sin is not a noble, independent, and eternal life, but slavery, ruin, and death. The wicked see that they have forfeited their life in rebellion. They are the far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory was offered upon them and despised, but how desirable it now appears. All this, cries the lost soul, I might have had. So only for a moment, heaven's opened. Only for a moment, I believe Nero sees, he is convicted, and he sees that, you know what? Here I am, putting Paul on trial. Here I am, but I think only for a moment he saw his own trial that day. Continuing on, Acts of the Apostles and sketches from the life of Paul, 3:15, 3:16, they both say the same thing. For a moment, heaven had been opened before him, and the words of Paul, and its peace and purity had appeared desirable. That moment of invitation, of mercy, was extended even to the guilty and hardened Nero, but only for that moment. The command was issued for Paul to be taken back to his dungeon. And as the door closed upon the messenger of God, so the door of repentance was forever closed against the emperor of Rome. Not another ray of light was ever to penetrate the darkness, the dense darkness that enveloped him. There was needed only this crowning act of rejection of the divine call to mercy. So how does Nero end? It's amazing, brothers and sisters, how you can live a whole life of sin, and it all comes down to that one moment. But, you know, the choice you make, it's all been made before. He made those choices all along, and that last moment, that last chance of hope, he just passed it away. So, AD 65, Nero survives 2 assassination attempts. In AD 67, Galba, a Roman commander, renounces his allegiance to Rome, to Nero, and decides to march on Rome with a force of troops. Now, what I had mentioned before is, as Nero became more and more insane, more and more of a tyrant, he would waste enormous amounts of money. So as he wasted this money, he would cease to pay the military, and they would be like a volunteer basis. So he had a lot of unhappy, disgruntled Roman legions and commanders, and that's why Galba decided to turn on him. In addition to all of that, since he was bankrupting his country, he was raising taxes all over the land, all over the Roman Empire, making him even less popular while he carried on extravagant feasts and extravagant debauchery. So he became so bad, so crazy, so embarrassing for the people of Rome that even the Senate turned on him, especially when they heard that the army was turning on him. At this time, it's said that Nero, and this is right around this time that the Senate turns on him, around AD 68, at this time Nero would waver between this crazy passivity where he's like, oh, whatever, it's okay, and fits of rage where he'd just go absolutely insane. We're not exactly sure when Paul was martyred after his trial. They say late 67, May, June 68. But around June of AD 68, Nero's own Praetorian Guard, which was the elite secret service, leaves him. So he wakes up in the palace one morning without the Praetorian Guard, without his people, without his servants, absolutely alone. And it said at that time that Nero goes into a complete panic. Ellen White speaks about this greatly. Some of the historians speak about this greatly. It says that he dons a hastily contrived disguise. Nero flees the palace in a panic. He goes to the home of one of his freedmen, Phaon, but on his way there, he's sneaking through the streets of Rome in the middle of the night, and he hears the peasants and the paupers calling out for his blood. And finally, he goes and digs under a ditch, under the wall into Phaon's house, and he holds up there for a while because he hears that Galba's coming into town and the Senate has condemned him and all the Roman populace wants to have his blood. Now, if you look at this, the Apostle Paul, if he died in June of AD 68 or May of AD 68, it could be that Nero died a month to days after the Apostle Paul was martyred. It says that Nero died June of AD 68. What he did is he intercepted a letter from the Senate to Phaon, who was his friend that he was hiding in his house. And the letter said that Nero had been condemned. And it said that Nero is a wanted man, there's a price on his head, and he needs to be killed. And when he figures that out, he screams out, it says, in horror, and he says, "What an artist the world is losing today." That's Nero for you. What an artist. It's not that I will lose my kingdom, I will lose my musical voice, I will lose my abilities as the best charioteer. I'm a theater guy, and they're losing this. What an artist the world is losing today. Hesitating, because he knows what will happen if they find him. He begs the men around him, "Why don't you commit suicide so I know how to do it myself properly?" And nobody does anything. Nobody does anything. It says at that time that Nero is exacerbated. And what he does is he finally tries to cut his own throat, but he's so bad at that, he can't even do it properly. And he sits there gasping and crying for someone to put him to death. And finally, one of his chief assistants finishes him off. It was only for a moment, just weeks, maybe months before, that he had that chance from God, when the heavens opened and he made his choice. And when he killed the servant of God, from what we can tell, from what we know in history, it was days to months later that his final chance of life ended. So, since I add the fourth king, the choice that these kings had is a choice for us to make. Because I think all of us can fall into this very same category. We can see it in our church, you know. It's convenient. Is it convenient for me to follow Christ all the way? Or will there be a time in our life that, you know what, the convenience is not right there for us? That's a Felix. Am I Agrippa, where, you know, I'm going to mock the truth? You think in such a short time you can convince me to be a Christian? Or am I a Festus where, you know what, I don't want any part of this. I don't have any conviction. I don't want anything of this. Or am I Nero, a crooked, evil person inside, and always, even though convicted, always wanting to destroy the truth? If you look at three of these men on this slide, I have the smiley face and also some sad faces. There's three sad faces. Three kings are convicted. One couldn't care less. But all of them were lost. So brothers and sisters, I ask that we, in our life, when we are convicted, because conviction happens many times. I believe we're convicted many times. You may be convicted from someone else's testimony. You may be convicted at a sermon. You may realize, you know what, inside my heart, I have many things that are wrong. But you can't stop there. And you can't just hold it for only a moment. You need to acknowledge your convictions and then finally obey and go and accept the path that Christ has given us. And that's Paul on his way to Damascus. He was going in a way, he realized that he was wrong, he was convicted, and he changed his life. And he became one of the greatest apostles of all time, who wrote the vast majority of our Bible, the New Testament, in his letters to the churches. Ellen White says in Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4, page 448, that God wants men of labor in his cause who have hearts as true as steel and who will stand steadfast in integrity, undaunted by circumstances, amid trial and gloom. They are just what they were when they were in the prosperous, in their prospects that were brightened by the hope, and when their outward surroundings were all that they could desire. Daniel in the lion's den is the same Daniel who stood before the king, enshrouded by the light of God. Paul in the dark dungeon, awaiting the sentence which he knew was to come from the cruel Nero, is the same Paul who addressed the court at the Areopagus, a man whose heart is stayed on God. In the hour of his most afflicting trials is the most discouraging surroundings is just what he is in prosperity. When the light and favor of God seem to be upon him, faith reaches to the unseen and grasps eternal things. So may we be consistent. May we be consistent. May we be the same person. Instant in season, instant out of season. Instant and ready to give an account when things are good, when the truth is popular, but also when it could mean our life. Those are the Pauls. Those are the Daniels of the Bible. May we be among those people. Paul, how does he come to an end? Sketches from the life of Paul says that his thoughts and hopes are centered in the second advent of his Lord. And as the sword of the executioner descends and the shadow of death gather about the martyr's soul, his latest thought springs forward, as will his earliest thought, in the great awakening, to meet the life-giver who shall welcome him to the joy of the blessed. Well, nigh a score of centuries have passed since Paul, the aged, poured out his blood as a witness for the word of God and for the testimony of Christ. No faithful hand recorded for generations to come the last scenes of the life of this holy man. But inspiration has preserved for us his dying testimony. Like a trumpet peal has his voice rung out through all the ages, nerving with his own courage thousands of witnesses for Christ and wakening thousands of sorrow-stricken hearts. The echo of his own triumphant joy. And what is his own triumphant joy? Let's turn with me to 2 Timothy 4, 6 through 8 in closing. For I am ready to be poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day. And not to me only, but also to all those who love his appearing.